About gifted education is what is the definition of intelligence, right? This is a long historical debate. Um, it used to be people thought a lot about language and logic as ways to define intelligence, and that is really what a lot of your basic achievement tests will link to. Then people started to think about both your static knowledge base as well as adaptive ways to handle and process information. That is what people are trying to capture when they give you an IQ test. And then there are other ways to think about um, what intelligence means that are really great and really, really important. Multiple intelligences, where you look at creativity and kinesthetic and emotional intelligence, are some of the newer ways of thinking about intelligence, but they're really, really hard to measure. Right. So that's one of the fundamental things that's really fraught about this topic, is trying to figure out who would qualify for gifted education services. We're sort of left with mediocre tools, right? So it is standard that people use an IQ WISC assessment, and typically people for a gifted education program within public schools or for an independent school, they're usually looking at academic giftedness. There also are special school programs for artistic giftedness, right? Like special schools of music or art. And we also have athletic teams and different levels of that for people who have kinesthetic giftedness, right? But we're really talking mostly about academic and creative giftedness when we talk about this topic. But there are so many different ways to expand our thinking that I think are really, really important. So with that as a backdrop, what is giftedness specifically, if you think about it, how it relates to intelligence? Well, every single child is a gift, right? And every single child has talents. So this calling it gifted education or giftedness is the term we use nationwide, but it is considered and to be, some people really dislike it because it feels elitist. It's really meant to be a way to describe kids whose abilities cannot be developed inside of a regular education program. And it's a group of kids with special education needs in that regard. Sometimes you can see kids' giftedness in their achievement levels already. They may be ahead or substantially ahead in one or more academic areas, right? Or there may be kids who have the potential for giftedness. They qualify for gifted education services, but they're not showing those achievement markers yet. So that's really, really important, that achievement and the potential for that kind of having that giftedness ability, achievement doesn't always show it. What you do see, though, is you see these traits where they like to learn really rapidly. They want to solve problems. There's this voracious just appetite that they want to figure things out. They tend to learn basic skills really quickly and they typically don't need a ton of practice. They ask a lot of questions. They want to go to higher levels of thinking. They won't let things go. Sometimes they have an unusual sort of heightened sense of ethics and intensity around worrying about like social issues or global issues. So there's this kind of heightened intensity and an ability to think abstract, and sometimes rapidity of thought and interaction, which is commonplace. A great resource to look at, which is where this is pulled from, is the National Association of Gifted Children. So really great resource. So different definitions for giftedness exist, and they're all pertinent. So one is that they have this potential to show an exceptional level of performance. Another is that it may be in areas of intellectual or creative or artistic or leadership, but they require services that aren't ordinarily provided in a regular education program. Another definition is that these are kids who have asynchronous development, right? So these are kids who have a heightened intensity, and they require that we change how we parent, how we counsel, and how we teach. So pre-pandemic, I'm sure the numbers are much higher now, but it was estimated that about 15% of the general education population really needs special social and emotional support, and that about 30% of the intellectually gifted population need special social and emotional support. So that's just kind of interesting that this group of people have kind of some unique capacities, but also some sometimes extra vulnerabilities which coexist as well. And we're going to talk more about that. So a common way to assess intelligence is with these imperfect IQ tests. The most common one is a WISC-5, and it has multiple different subcategories that it is evaluating. So one is your verbal intelligence. One is your visual, spatial sort of ways of seeing things. Another is your fluid reasoning about how you tend to think about concepts and move across categories. Those three together are sometimes rolled up to create a GAI, a general aptitude intelligence. It's kind of a generalized IQ proxy number, if you will. A full scale IQ is calculated when you're looking across all 5 of these areas. So that adds on processing speed, which is exactly what it sounds like, and your working memory, the things you can hold in your mind and use and retrieve quickly to do all that problem solving. Now, many kids are asynchronous in ways across these categories, and that tells a story. It tells a really powerful story about their learning profile and what they need. So sometimes it's actually much more pertinent to look at the subscores than a full scale IQ score when you're thinking about the needs of a learner and what kind of special supports they may need to support their giftedness. There are other IQ assessments as well. The WIPSI is an IQ assessment for kids under 6. Woodcock-Johnson is an assessment that is used. Sometimes people will ceiling out on the WISC-5. If you're a gifted kid, you may not really, it's kind of tough to get a full scale IQ score over 135 or 140. And so sometimes people will do a Woodcock-Johnson assessment if they want a higher test ceiling. Now, the converse of that is that unless you know exactly what you're going to do within an additional IQ test, there isn't necessarily any value in having it. But again, I just want to emphasize, there are also lots of problems with IQ testing. It is very imperfect. If there's dual language, you may have suppressed scores. If there's anxiety, if this person taking the evaluation doesn't really like the evaluator, that may suppress scores. So it is fraught. And there's a long history really thinking about some of the cultural bias that has existed in these evaluations over the years. So it's imperfect, but it is a tool we've got. So this is an example of WISC scores for a gifted kid. And what do you see in terms of asynchrony, right? These are very high scores. But you can see the processing speed that's in the high average range at 114. So this is a kid, what this is telling you with a 142 verbal and a 147 visual spatial, this kid's going to be really a natural at learning to read, is going to be incredibly good at math. But putting them in a timed testing situation is probably going to make them feel really frustrated because their speed of how they operate isn't keeping pace with their abilities. Right? So whenever there is a gap, sometimes people have thought about it as being more than 10 points. People also sometimes think about it as how many standard deviations is it different. But when there's that gap between the high and low score or different scores, many neuropsychologists won't roll up and will not report a full scale IQ. And that's when they're sometimes using that general ability index instead. But it is really interesting. Sometimes you'll have a student with really high visual spatial reasoning, but not having particularly accelerated verbal comprehension. That kid needs great math and great 3-dimensional learning and great art to really show their strengths and their talents. And that's a mindset about gifted education, is you really want to take a strengths-based approach to have kids understand and identify with their areas of strength, not with arrogance, with humility. But really, we as parents and educators want to help kids grow in their areas of strength as well as shoring up their deficits, not just work on the areas of struggle. So a gifted student, especially in elementary school, will typically show up already knowing as much as, half, 40%, 50%, sometimes even more of what's taught in a typical age-directed curriculum for the school year. They also typically learn things just really quickly. They'll kind of hear it, get it, understand it the first or second time, Most school programs are structured to have 6 or 7 repetitions, which is what most, bright kids need to learn. Schools are oftentimes set up so that the first 6 weeks of school are repeat. Gifted students they kind of are reviewing from the previous year. A lot of times gifted kids don't need that, and they may in fact have made progress over the summer when they aren't constrained by school, and they may become better readers or better in some of their thinking skills. It's also of note that your kind of IQ, if you get an evaluation from when you're small, when you're 5 or 6, that number may not be at all the same once you're an adult, because it is fundamentally, it's more affected by genetics earlier in life, and then the environment you're in and the opportunities you have a bigger impact on your kind of adult IQ score, as you go through your life. Now, the point isn't IQ scores, like, who cares? It's not about a number. It's ultimately, we really believe that kids should be able to become their best self. And gifted kids are ones who need these gifted education services. And we want kids to be able to develop in their talents at school, in every school, all over the world, right? We as a world need these gifted kids to be able to help us with climate change and peace and drug discovery. So something else to keep in mind about what's fraught oftentimes in classrooms is that a lot of times teachers are taught that heterogeneous classrooms, that's mixed ability, right, are really nirvana, are really great for all kids. That's what I was taught when I was training to become a teacher. I'm sure that's what Sarah was taught when she was training to be a teacher initially. But it's not true. So the kind of the reputation, or what people think, is that the high kids will pull up the middle kids, and that the high kids were going to do fine anywhere. But it doesn't end up working that way. And teachers can really struggle to differentiate in the really dramatic ways that are needed when you've got gifted learners in these kind of classrooms that are really age-based and age-limited. So we really need a new model across really the whole nation. Massachusetts is uniquely poor in gifted education. I think most of you on this call tonight are from Massachusetts. We're actually last in the nation across every category in terms of not having a definition, not really having any funding, not having gifted education programs in public schools. So it's much better in many other places. But about up to like 40% of gifted kids become underperformers in school, which completely flies in the face of this idea of these kids will do fine anywhere. That's one of the myths that we want to debunk. But they can have these capacities that can hide because they feel different. They're wondering about things that aren't typical for their age. They may be using different types of vocabulary. Regular education is just so frustrating that they can end up disengaging. They can do school refusal. Sometimes they really feel like outliers, and they can get depressed and anxious. And sometimes the more vulnerable a child is, the more gifted they are, the more vulnerable they can be for some of these experiences of isolation and depression. And we lose the chance to engage their talents for the world, right? So, an analogy people have talked about for the past couple of decades around this topic is they'll talk about a cheetah. If it's, on the open plain, it can run 60 to 70 miles an hour, right? But if it's raised in a zoo, it will only be able to, at its full speed as an adult, be able to run like 30 to 40 miles an hour because it was kept in a cage. The analogy is pertinent. So what are some of the myths that we hear about gifted kids? That they don't need help, they do fine anywhere. That's just not true, which we've already talked about. But an analogy is that it's really clear across the United States that if you have a gifted athlete, you're going to really work hard to make sure they're playing at their level. They're going to be in the right level as a tennis player. They're going to be in the right soccer team. You're going to go out with your 8-year-old and they'll have 4 different levels of soccer teams in the town that I live in. But yet we put them all in the same math class. We also know if they're really great as a musician, we want to make sure they have the right kind of coach and tutor and teacher for their talent. But it's also important we're doing that for these academic and conceptual areas and other types of creative thinking and problem solving. Another myth is that teachers do challenge all students. So gifted kids will be fine in regular classrooms, but that just isn't true. Most teachers actually aren't trained in gifted education, and they don't understand the unique needs and profiles of gifted students. There's a myth that all children are gifted, and every single child is an exception, is has talents and is a gift, right? But not everybody has exceptional academic aptitude that requires different types of educational services to support their growth. It really, the best type of gifted education, even if a child is 3 grades ahead in reading and 3 grades ahead in math, they still are able to learn in reading, in math at school. They're not asked to just wait because they happen to be above what's typical. So that requires some individualized pathways for learning for kids. So the myth is that accelerated options are harmful for kids, for gifted kids. That's not true. They really do need those opportunities because that is when they engage best. That is how they want to go to school, and that's how they get fired up and are full. Learning complex things and figuring things out is like candy for intellectually gifted kids. It's just, there's this craving. So another myth is that these programs are elitist, and we really see, actually, arguably, it's kind of the opposite. There's unique vulnerabilities and fragilities that these kids need. It's really a group of kids who need special education services that are called, in some states, gifted education is labeled as part of special education. Sometimes gifted kids can receive poor grades. I know in the town I live in middle school, you're not allowed to be in the higher level science class, which they differentiate once you get to 7th grade, unless you got an A in 6th grade science. But yet some kids, especially those kids with asynchronous profiles, may really love science, may be really great at science, but they're a little slower with their processing speed or working memory, which is probably going to mean that they struggle with organization, which is likely to mean that the science they're learning may be too easy for them, plus they struggle with organization. They may not get very good grades. Ironically, that child is probably going to do better when you give them harder science than if you put them in an easier class. But that's a huge myth that gifted kids are going to get good grades, or that a kid who doesn't get good grades isn't gifted. Some gifted kids are happy and popular and well-adjusted, and lots aren't. They can have an intensity which can make them feel more like an outlier. It can make them feel separated. And we already talked about that a higher percentage of these kids need special social and emotional support. You can have a disability and be gifted. So these kids who are, we talk about as being twice exceptional or 2E, if you're dyslexic and gifted, you can have a very high verbal IQ, but yet have very average reading ability. And the trick is that then that high verbal skill will help you be able to accommodate for that you're struggling with the reading, the way you're taught to read in regular school. So you're not getting those dyslexic needs kind of tutored and met. And the dyslexia part of who you are in your profile hides some of the giftedness. And that is true across the board. Some kids may have some distractibility and ADHD that coexists with their giftedness, which means that they have extraordinary powers of focus. They just don't have the ability to control when they focus. So that's a kid who is going to do a lot better on the hard section of the test, or a lot better with really complex material and ideas than they will with really simple stuff. So the disability and the twice exceptionality is pertinent. So another thing is that AP courses, excuse me, with Jones Ertel High School are gifted education, and they are not. AP courses are a lot about having one syllabus and a lot of content that you move really quickly through. So rapid coverage of content may help fill up some of the needs of the voracious appetite of a gifted kid to figure things out and learn things, but those are not gifted education services. That is different. So I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague, Sarah. And Sarah has been at our school for a long time. she used to be our director of the entire faculty, and now she is our director of education innovation, which is our public outreach program. And she has her graduate degree from Harvard. And it's really a privilege to have her as part of our community. So I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Courtney. And I will start by saying I am not a neuroscientist, but having been in this field for a long time and really have had the privilege of working with so many gifted children at Acera, and then as my work in the public schools, seeing how these children really do show up differently in our classrooms very often. So Dabrowski is a psychologist who really started thinking about this term of overexcitabilities. And this is something that the gifted population really manifests through behavior and through these markers. And Dabrowski was Polish. And so the overexcitabilities really kind of translates more likely to heightened sensitivities. So there are these 5 areas of what are called overexcitabilities, and these are not unique only to gifted people, but in the gifted population, these will show up often as one or more areas that are just more heightened. So there are these 5 areas, psychomotor, and this is, the child or the adult, right? These are all, they're through the lifespan. The child who has a lot of extra energy. This is a child who can't sit still. These are people who generally thrive in sports environments or, rock climbing, skiing. There's an intense need for movement. The imaginational overexcitability is really this world of imagination. So children and adults who have this live sometimes in a world of fantasy. There's sometimes a weaving of fantasy and reality for them, but they have these incredible, fantastical worlds in their mind. These are, the writers, the thinkers, the poets. There's the emotional overexcitability, and this is one that we really see because there are these extreme empathy, extreme emotions, extreme responses. There's a real weight of the world for these children and adults. They're able to understand with their high intellectual ability, and it turns into these incredible intensities for them around understanding how big these problems are, right? So 2 children who are learning about climate change, if one of them is gifted and has this emotional overexcitability, learning about climate change can be just, absolutely terrifying for them in a way that a more neurotypical child might say, okay, that's scary, but I am going to focus back on my Legos, right? But for a child with this profile, this can be really devastating. The intellectual overexcitability is someone who's constantly thinking, constantly asking questions. These are the voracious readers. They just kind of don't stop thinking. And then the sensual one, this is really, these are 5 senses, and they will often have a much richer experience with the world than the neurotypical person. They often also need time to kind of for lower stimulation. So they'll need to kind of withdraw and go into a place without so many inputs, but they may have a stronger reaction to smells. Lights and sounds might be more intense for them. Fabric, sensory things are just, it's all a little more extreme for them. And again, some of these things can coexist with an additional special need like anxiety, like being on the autism spectrum, like ADHD. And so sometimes those things coexist. And these are very common experiences for a gifted person. It is very interesting. If there's anything that we can say about brain science, is that it's very primitive, where our understanding is really evolving. But we do know a few things based on what the research shares. We know that the gifted brain actually really looks different and responds differently. There's a really interesting paper that was published in Nature about this increased white matter integrity. And this is genetic, but there's a different way that the white matter is responding more fluidly in the gifted brain. They're using glucose differently because of the way it's metabolizing, because of the extreme energy that's happening in those parts of the brain. The gifted brain cortex develops differently. And we also know that higher IQ is also correlated with higher rates of both psychological and physiological conditions. And we also know that the gifted child or the gifted person is as diverse, fluid, and subject to the environment as the rest of our population, right? We know that IQ is only measuring certain types of giftedness. We know that the gifted person has a whole lifespan, and that being a gifted person when you're a child is also has its interesting perks in your advanced age. And we also know that the way that IQ shows up and that someone can show up with their full gifts really depends on things like prenatal care, parenting, exposure. Next slide.
Oops, sorry.
Oh. So a little bit about some of the brain development. So again, I'm not a neuroscientist. If you are a neuroscientist, feel free to chime in here. But there's some interesting research that's come out through the National Institute of Mental Health, which is as a group within the National Institutes of Health, about cortical development. And this is really interesting about how the cortex actually begins developing earlier, and this time of development actually lasts longer in gifted children. And so this is really the kind of the most extreme differences are in those prefrontal cortex, and that's the area for executive functioning, planning, and abstract reasoning. And those areas are particularly pronounced in this study. This is for, they're looking at 3 different groups of children. They studied about 25 children with a superior intelligence, that's in the top 2 percentile of IQ, high intelligence, and an average intelligence. And you can see in that superior intelligence, there's a higher rate of change, both across the quick thickening of the cortex and the thinning of the cortex that happens in adolescence, which is really attributed to kind of a winnowing of unneeded information. But this also points to a real need for this time of learning for children, and how it is so important for them to be able to reach their full potential, because there is such an extreme rate of development for them that childhood is a really important time for the gifted person to be able to really use the full elasticity of their brain. Next slide. Thank you. We also know that they perceive differently. We talked a little bit about overexcitabilities, but the gifted brain just is showing up differently. This is a great survey of literature here that was put out in the gifted kids, the gifted brain. It's a website that thinks about the gifted children, and it was a survey of literature by Nicole Tetreault and Matt Zakarski, and they're really thinking about this huge body of work that's starting to look at these brain differences. So we'll send you as a follow-up some resources so you can dive into these studies, but they're quite interesting about how gifted people are really experiencing the world, and their physiological responses are also different.
So there are lots of different profiles of gifted kids. So one is that kind of classic successful kid who is well liked by teachers and parents. They're the kids who are going to get straight A's. Looks like they're doing great in the regular system, except that oftentimes these kids are also kids with extraordinary emotional intelligence, and they're going to read the cues in the room, and they're going to throttle back and not actually ask all the questions of what they're really wondering, because they recognize that that isn't where everybody else is. They also have the risk of then kind of going sideways with getting into complex social stuff or trying to work the system to get what they want, because their real intellectual sort of voraciousness and potential isn't being met in a schooling program. So there are some vulnerabilities for this group who looks on the surface, if you're getting all 100% on all A's or whatever, that doesn't mean you're thriving. That might actually mean that you're just really bored, and you could have done really well in those same tests if you've never actually gone to the school that's teaching you what you're supposed to be learning. So that's one profile. Then there's a profile that shows up as a really challenging person. So they're sort of really good at divergent thinking. They're creative. They tend to be outspoken. They can be experienced as really frustrating for teachers, and can irritate people because they're pressing on the system, and they also can feel frustrated by the system that they're not feeling validated or seen because they are challengers and they may just be expressing things in ways that are not typical. They can be really spontaneous, which can be disruptive, but they have a high risk of losing interest. Sometimes gifted kids will drop out of school. So these kids are very, very likely to develop a really negative self-concept as well. There are the kids who've gone underground. So these may be kids who were really curious and really engaged early, asked lots of questions, but never really had the runway to kind of keep learning. And then at some point, maybe they just stopped even trying to do that because they were focused on, well, I'm just not going to go to the hard math class anymore because I want to hang out with my friends, and my friends tease me. They think it's kind of weird. So I'm going to not really let people know what I'm capable of because I'm just going to be socially sort of like fitting in. Or these are kids who they get frustrated that school isn't meeting their needs, that it's like going to a regular education program is like being asked to do the same thing over and over and over. And it's so frustrating that they can end up getting into school refusal, and depression. There are twice exceptional kids. We already talked about those profiles to some extent. There is the kid who ends up actually being really angry and dropping out. And then there is the kind of autonomous learner. That's what we all aspire for gifted kids to become in school, which is that they have this intrinsic motivation that's been, cultivated in school. And they believe that they can have an impact. They're taking initiative and they're working the system to actually make it work for them. So they're the person who might say, hey, I'm going to go to the administrator and see if I can start a new after school club, or, hey, I am going to, ask as extra credit, instead of just submitting this research paper, I also built this whole huge thing to go with it. Those are a couple of very kind of typical ways that these kids might really engage and make the system work for them. Or they may be having huge other projects they're doing outside of school, right? They may start their own business on the side, or they may be engaged in some really robust volunteering opportunities, or tinker and do some amazing building and construction and electronics that has nothing to do with school. But so they just go to school to check the box, but really where they're identity and intellectual world is living is outside of that environment, which can feel pretty limiting to them. But still, they're finding a way to keep growing. They're making it work, no matter what. And in particular, one of the kind of frequent models in that kind of highly successful category are girls. So the research tells us, and so do our experiences anecdotally show us, that parents are much more often likely to seek out evaluation for and alternative programming for their gifted sons over their gifted daughters. I think, and I don't have the data to back this one up, but what I observe and what I think is that this is because biological females often develop their emotional intelligence about 2 years ahead of their same-aged biological male peers. And so they read the cues in the room, right? They're the ones who they throttle back. They don't ask the thing because they realize other people aren't ready for it. And then we don't realize it. We don't see it. They don't extrovert what is being misfit. Now, this isn't always true of all girls. It can be the other way around, right? But it's just a heads up. If you're an educator or a counselor or a parent, keep in mind that your gifted girl who's seeming anxious and depressed, the cause may be related to some of those overexcitabilities and sensitivities and extra emotional attunement, which is making the world a lot more tricky. Or it may be they're just fitting in socially and they're not bothering to show what they're capable of, because it's, socially not rewarded. So don't undershoot your girls. I think historically we've talked about that siblings are usually within about 6 IQ points of each other. Imperfect, because we know full scale IQ is not always able to be computed. But if in a family, if one of the children in the family is gifted, it's highly likely that the siblings would qualify for gifted education services as well, which is just interesting to note.
And folks,
So
as you're thinking about this, I just want to remind people we will have lots of time for discussion and questions at the end. So we'll definitely invite you to turn your cameras on and just have a more full conversation, because I know we're giving a lot of information to you, and we really want to hear your questions and thoughts of what is sticking out to you.
So we're trying to fly through the presentation part so we can get to the dialogue and the real conversation, because I believe we set this up to go until 8:30. So what are some of the different strategies that can happen in school and that you as a parent can request, or you as an educator can bring in? So one is acceleration. There's all different types of acceleration. Many of them are not done as often now as they were a generation ago. There's grade skipping. Again, most school districts won't do that, but we have seen that the literature tells us that most people need 2 grades skipped in order for it to make enough of an academic difference. But then you also have some of the problems with social maturity. So historically there were some scales that helped determine if a child had the emotional intelligence and maturity necessary for acceleration, a whole grade acceleration to work. Now there's subject-based acceleration, which everyone should have. Every school should have that, especially in math. Math is one of the areas that's the hardest to differentiate within a mixed ability classroom, especially as kids get more gifted and more capable. But that type of acceleration, there are many other types. Another is kids going to kindergarten early. There are many. Another kind of key strategy is differentiated instruction. So that is something that teachers really aspire to do. And a lot of times school districts will have special training to support them to do it. But unwittingly, sometimes standardized curriculum may make it so sometimes it can help support their ability to differentiate, which means that you're going to have different types of expanded questions, or kind of more divergent pieces of assignments, or additional things that can be added on, or using kind of groups in project-based learning where some kids are going to have the part of the project and the challenge. So those are different types of ways to do differentiated instruction. Sarah, do you want to add anything to the differentiated instruction one right now?
I mean, I think it is a hard thing for teachers to do when you have a big class. I think all teachers want to do this really well, and it's incredibly difficult to do well. I think so often what we see happen to gifted children in those heterogeneous classrooms is that the teacher says, okay, well, you can try this really advanced text, and then the child has to go sit and do it by themselves, which is kind of starting differentiation, but not really giving the child an opportunity to really show what they know and participate with peers, which is a really important part of gifted education, is to have other people who can kind of match their intellectual rigor.
Yep. And that leads directly into grouping. So, you often can remember being in, first grade, there were reading groups. There still are in most classrooms, that you are learning to read with other kids who are roughly at the same level as you. Now, in the best case, we would be evaluating kids at the start of every year, not just first graders, what reading group they should go to at the start of the year, but every single year, where is every child at the start of the year across multiple domains, and then group them in a way that fits what they're next ready to learn that year. And then setting goals and comparing children to themselves, so that my goals as a third grader who's ready for like fifth grade math is that I'm going to learn a year of math so that at the end of the year I'm ready for sixth grade math, even though I'm only kind of a third grader. So the intent then is that if you have an individual learning pathway and plan, then you could be grouped correctly, and we would compare a child's growth to themselves, and not just to some other person who happens to share their birthday. So Curriculum compacting is another common strategy that people talk about in education, which one of the ways to do it is to kind of do some evaluation. It may be, hey, this section, this unit is one we can skip, or it may be that you're trying to kind of shrink them down or tighten them up so you've got more time for like project-based learning or so you can cover more. Pre-assessments are the thing I was talking about a minute ago that are really key, especially for gifted kids, to make sure you're not teaching them something that they actually already knew. This can be scary for teachers because if you pre-assess a kid and then they already know it, what are you going to do with them? Ideally you would ability group them and put them somewhere else, or you give them differentiated instruction for something to do something different that's beyond what the others are getting taught. So you can start to see how a lot of these strategies interweave and interrelate with each other. I already spoke a little bit about individual learning plans. I think the common assumption is that these would be very, very hard to do in large public school classrooms. I don't think that's true. I believe it is possible. Sarah and I, and along with Trent, we're now in our 4th year. We're actually going into our 5th year of a relationship with an urban school that has, large classrooms and a lot of kids with tough situations, multiple languages. And that principal is really seeing, wow, all these strategies that, happen in a school like Acera, we can do those in a large urban school. It just requires that we change our mindset. So if we spent less time on standardized testing and more time on individualizing and having learning plans that fit each child, this could work. So we have IEPs that exist, individual educational plans, and those are usually legal documents and are focused for kids with disabilities. But ideally, an individual learning plan would also include their above grade level readiness in reading and math and science and beyond. Another kind of way to meet the needs of gifted kids is, instead of ending some sort of unit with like a test where you show that you kind of did the basic things or multiple choice, you have a demonstration of understanding. So that can take many forms. Again, all these strategies can be pertinent for all kids. It's just gifted kids need them even more, right? But a demonstration of understanding might be that at the end of the unit on Shakespeare, they put on a play that's, improv, that's comedic, that uses some of the concepts about the rhythm of literature that they learned in Shakespeare. Or it might be that they have a scientific poster session and invite parents in and kind of pitch their posters rather than having a science test. And they show the concepts and what they understood about the concepts in those events. Or it could be any kind of symposium or performance that is ideally live and has a real audience. It's so much more meaningful, and also it isn't limited what you can show about what you know in that environment, and is very, very motivating. That very much links to having open-ended projects. Now, open-ended projects doesn't mean do whatever you want. An open-ended project might say, these are key components to include, these are your goals, these are the limits, these are your constraints, but there's so many ways to get the right answer, so that there's divergent, open-ended thinking and problem solving that can happen with it, right? So again, the open-ended projects can be great for all kids, but for gifted kids, it's the freedom of like, wow, I don't just have to do what's on the sheet. I can make this whole huge thing and manifest. And another key part that, again, important for all kids, but maybe even more important for gifted kids with those extra sensitive profiles of school culture. We want to have positive school cultures that are great for mental health. We want to have a school culture that really embraces divergent, interdisciplinary, and complex thinking, because those are the things kids really, really crave and want to go to quickly when they have that kind of gifted brain. As opposed to it being more knowledge-driven or more test-driven or more close-ended in their learning pathway. So at Acera, we have a point of view about how teaching and learning happens, and it's based upon the evidence and what we learn about from educational research in psychology and neuroscience. And it's also based on really deep reading and understanding of what are the best practices in gifted education and what do these kids uniquely need. So it's kind of merging both of these together. And it's kind of incorporates a lot of the things we just talked about. So learning based upon ability with those kind of start of school year assessments so that kids can be in just the right level. So we have an ability-based math block, and that is something that could exist in all schools. If you have in elementary schools math classes happening at the same time, kids could go to the right math class that fits their level, even if it is ahead or even dramatically ahead. But it takes courage to change the system, right? Individualizing learning. So that's a learning pathway and plan. That also might be that you're giving kids more choices. And then they can go further because they aren't going to pick the thing they already know, right? And if you combine that with early and deep exposure to STEM and learning that's integrated across disciplines, it just kind of opens up the whole world. So that is another key, that you're not keeping subjects kind of discrete, really integrating learning across disciplines. It's ridiculous to say that social studies is separate from science, which is separate from writing, which is separate from literature. Of course, they're all interrelated. Of course, we're all using all of those in our jobs and in our lives. But integrating learning across disciplines, again, is a better way for all kids to have meaning and context about why am I learning this? Well, if it's pitched to something that's bigger than just this specific topic, who cares about grammar or diagramming sentences? But if I'm trying to write a persuasive piece to my, state representative about why I think there should be a change in something, and then I'm going to create a podcast on it, I'm probably going to care more about making sure that my speaking is really solid. I'm going to care more about the grammar because I'm using it. Early and deep exposure to STEM is something, again, all kids should have, but a lot of public school districts focus standardized testing on, essential math and reading and comprehension. And then what can happen is that they just run out of time to do very much in the sciences. Again, this is especially true in elementary school. We believe and we think that the world needs for us, and that kids are curious about how things work and how things fit together. We also see that kids are capable of far more than the age-based standards that people will tell you. There's this thing that you're taught in teacher school of kids can't think abstractly before third grade, and that just isn't true. Gifted kids, you can make analogies, you can make things three-dimensional. They're able to really get into some sophisticated concepts far earlier than you would expect. So let's put it out there for them and let them eat it up. And that, it's richer for everybody then to have these opportunities. Safeguarding the spirit and curiosity of kids is of tantamount importance, of course. Building the social and emotional learning piece is so critical. And for some kids, many kids, you need to break things down to really support that emotional intelligence growth, that growth in persistence, sticking with things even when they're difficult, right? That ability to see the needs and take the perspective of other people and take turns with ideas and collaborate. Those are critical skills to enable people to unleash their talents in their world as adults. Yeah, I think you get the idea. Catalyzing student initiative is so powerful, right? So if a child has an idea of, I want to, build this thing on the playground, like, why can't they do that at every school, right? I want to start this after school club. Great, do it. I want to, is it possible we could create a buddy program and that the fourth graders could read books to the kindergartners? Yes. So being a kind of culture and environment that enables kids to really, catalyze and try and solve things, it is the kind of things that gives them courage to keep trying harder and to keep growing. Now I'm going to forward my slides. Apologies. So what are strategies for families? Right? You can't control all of what's happening in school, But I think one big thing is if you seek a WISC or an IQ evaluation that can tell you some things, and then really sit with the evaluator to understand what the subscores mean and how that rolls up a learning profile for your child. Ideally, do a full neuropsych evaluation. These are extremely expensive, but there's no manual for raising a kid, but this is as good as you're going to get in terms of understanding who your child is, what their struggles are. Everybody's got them. What their strengths are. Everybody's got them, and how to try to support them as a parent and in their educational experience. If when you have a gifted kid, some people move to a place with really strong public education, gifted education services. You can do research and you can figure that out. Massachusetts is not it. There are much stronger programs for gifted education in Florida, in Mississippi, in California, in Texas. So it is a viable reason to move, is to get these services in public education. The talented and gifted programs, AG, academically gifted programs, GATE, gifted and talented education. Those are some of the different acronyms used in different states and in different places around the kind of real robust programming that does exist for gifted students. You can support your child when they come home with some stuff to try to differentiate the instruction and give them expansions, which is kind of helps them understand things with like a bigger ceiling. Ideally, you can ask teachers to do differentiated instruction in the classroom, and instead of having more work at the end, they swap it out with work that's appropriate for the child. So differentiated instruction at school is not just tack on extra work. That is what is most common. Arguably, maybe that's better than nothing, but ideally they're swapping out. And sometimes you might be able to partner with a teacher to get them to do some of that, especially if you're going to help. Grouping is great to do. Some of the groups you can look into as a parent when you're grouping some kids with other kids who are also creative is you can create, you can tap into some of the programs that exist that can come out of your house. So one of those is Destination Imagination. You can run a Destination Imagination team out of your, in a room in your home and participate in that. And they're incredibly creative. It's really powerful. First Lego League is another one. These are parent-led, volunteer-led kinds of groups, but you can start one and you can ask some friends, and that can be really, really helpful for your child. I think another one is not pressuring your kid to achieve, right? Which feels ironic, but the main thing is you want your child to have an experience of freedom and curiosity and tap that intrinsic drive and motivation rather than feel scared that if they don't do well enough or they don't have the grades that they're not proving and they're not showing people how talented they are. So you want to turn it around so that they're asking questions and you're feeding what is curious, and that you are praising them for working hard and wondering about and asking, right? Rather than praising them for being smart. So those are kind of important ways philosophically to be as a parent, that it's not about like getting, all A's or the best score or into the right college. It's really about curiosity and freedom and being yourself. And that is the environment in which a child can really thrive. I think you want to not again, this is ironic. You kind of can feel like you want to enrich the kids so much because school may not be doing all of what they need. Actually, a gifted kid needs free time. Then they might create their own thing that they've built or started, or read books, climb trees. Those things are also really, really important to have time to wonder and have time to invent something of their own interests. Yeah, so those are some things for families. So I already mentioned the thing about launching a home team. Many parents of gifted kids homeschool, which does not mean you teach your kid everything. It means you've taken responsibility to create a plan to educate your child. And there's tremendous resources. There's other parent groups. There are, your local science museum, or there's so many places that field trips are, wide open during the school day when other kids are at school. So there's some really great programs out there to bring together. And now, especially after COVID, there are even more online based programs that you can move through in an adaptive way to kind of be able to fly through um, things, and that's not as good, I think, as learning in person in community. But I think you can get some great academic growth in adaptive online tools, but then you need to make sure they get applied in other ways inside of a community. Make sure the counseling side, make sure your gifted child may do well with having some counseling help, to really think about what to do when they're distressed about climate change, or friends who they feel responsible for when it isn't really their job to feel as responsible, or knowing the social skills to make friends. Um, I think you're seeing the themes here about curiosity and love of learning. And openness. So I think another thing that's really important with a gifted kid is you don't really want to have them have so much an identity as a gifted kid. You want them to have an identity and to feel proud about being curious, and that they're creative and they try things, and that they mess up, right? So they're building their rocket and they didn't work, and they're so excited because they're going to try it again. And that whole mindset of try it, make a mess, try it again, stick with it. It can be difficult sometimes as a parent, because they may turn, I've heard stories of people turning this whole bathroom like into this science lab, cardboards everywhere with like tape, and stuff's getting stuck on the walls, and go with it, embrace the mess. This is really, really rich and vibrant for children. And another big thing as a parent is again, it goes back to the praising kids for working hard, not for being smart, is you really want to inculcate that growth mindset. So when they make a mistake, that they get an identity, not for knowing a lot, but for being able to show that they can learn. Very, very different mindset. But really, really powerful. And as much as the things they're doing, that there's lots of ways to be right, there's lots of ways to succeed, there's divergent outcomes, that's inspiring creativity. And then it's just, then there isn't a stopping point. They can keep going. So these are some of the common resources for families around National Association for Gifted Children, Davidson Institute, Hoagie's Gifted page. It's kind of a mess when you open it, but it's got links to everything. There are some different programs for identifying youth in some states, in some regions of the country. And then there are different types of enrichment opportunities, which can be really helpful. But obviously it's best if there's gifted education services, from 8:30 to 3 every day in a core school program.